Once there was an inn in the isolated Kentucky mountains where the wilderness road forged its perilous course toward the western border, and travelers spoke of it in whispered, respectful terms. They claimed that Millbrook Inn provided a warmth that extended well beyond hot meals and tidy beds, something that no other institution could match. This mountain sanctuary was run by 4 sisters, and tired men would come as strangers and go with the impression that they had found something valuable, something worth the perilous return trip. 3 states were affected by the Cunningham sisters' reputation. Business travelers would postpone their journeys solely to stay at Millbrook Inn for an additional night. Instead of passing up the chance to enjoy the renowned hospitality of the sisters, cattlemen would take perilous detours via inhospitable mountain passes. People who had stayed there talked of the amenities that lonely travelers hardly ever experienced, such close personal attention that made adult men cry when it was time to depart. However, a change occurred in the winter of 1851. Travelers started bringing unsettling stories to communities across Kentucky. They said that abandoned wagons and untrained horses were now all over the road to Millbrook Inn. Until a pattern became apparent, local authorities discounted these stories as frontier hysteria. The tumbling hillside trail that led to the Cunningham sisters' hospitable door was the last spot anyone remembers seeing the dozens of men who had disappeared without a trace. Please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell for me before we continue with the account of what actually transpired in those remote Kentucky highlands. Such stories are not to be missed. Additionally, let me know in the comments which state you are listening from. I enjoy interacting with listeners nationwide who are as enthralled with America's hidden mysteries as I am. The warmth that guests experienced at Millbrook Inn came at a far more horrific cost than anyone could have predicted, as authorities were soon to learn. When Jeremiah Cunningham died of alcoholic poisoning in 1831, he left behind a prosperous mountain estate and 4 daughters, ages 16 to 26. Scattered across 800 acres of lush mountain, the Cunningham property was situated in the isolated highlands between the Kentucky frontier and Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. It featured grain fields, livestock, and most importantly, a well-located inn that catered to travelers traveling west on the Wilderness Road. At 26, Margaret was the oldest and had the calculating, cold personality that would eventually prove so lethal, as well as the keen mind of a great entrepreneur. 24-year-old Catherine had inherited their mother's ethereal beauty and her nearly magical capacity to make any man feel like the most important person in the world. The 2-year-old Sarah imparted her late mother's expertise in mountain plants and their diverse uses, which turned out to be considerably more evil than anyone had anticipated. Additionally, Elizabeth, who was the youngest at 16, had a gentle charm that could calm down even the most wary traveler. In 1798, when the Wilderness Road was merely a perilous path carved through harsh terrain, their grandfather had constructed the Cunningham estate. It had developed into one of the most reputable resting places for traders, colonists, and explorers traveling to Kentucky's bluegrass land by 1831. Perched on a ridge with a view of the valley below, the main house was a large 2-story log building with stone foundations. The inn part included a kitchen that could feed hundreds, a spacious common area with enormous stone fireplaces, and 6 cozy guest rooms. The reputation for hospitality that had been meticulously built over 3 decades was what set the Cunningham property apart, not only its location or amenities. In places hundreds of miles away, travelers would talk of the comfort of clean beds after weeks on perilous routes, the warmth of the Cunningham greeting, and the quality of their mountain whiskey. More precious than gold, Jeremiah had established confidence. There was a small but devoted staff at the site. Since the beginning of the inn, Ezra Hawthorne, a seasoned mountain man in his 52nds, had served as foreman. His devotion to the Cunningham family was unwavering, and he had an extensive knowledge of the mountains. 3 years prior, 2 German immigrants, Klaus and Heinrich Zimmer, had come to the New World in search of employment and security. They ran the livestock and agricultural operations with Germanic efficiency while residing in a cottage close to the eastern edge of the property. What the townspeople would subsequently refer to as the inn's golden years began in the fall of 1831. Initially collaborating out of need, The sisters found they had a unique talent for making visitors feel not only welcomed, but also valued. The business remained prosperous, because to Margaret's business sense, because to Catherine's appeal, people stayed longer than expected. Their reputation for comfort was further strengthened by Sarah's expertise in medicinal teas and mountain cookery, and even the most exhausted passengers smiled at Elizabeth's childlike excitement. However, beneath this exterior of alpine friendliness, something sinister was brewing. Once shielding the Cunningham family from the perils of frontier life, its seclusion now offered a completely different benefit: privacy. Furthermore, seclusion might be quite harmful for four young ladies with strong minds and no morality. The first sign of the impending darkness was seen when Thomas Kellerman arrived at Millbrook Inn on a November evening in 1832. Kellerman, a Richmond-based cattle buyer, was traveling alone with a sizable bag of gold coins that he planned to acquire in Kentucky. He was a 45-year-old man who had recently been widowed, had no children, and had few close friends, exactly the kind of visitor the sisters would come to fearfully recognize. When Kellerman's horse staggered up the steep route to the inn, it was already below freezing, and a light snow was starting to fall. Margaret noticed right away the weight of his saddlebags, the quality of his clothes, and most importantly, the loneliness in his eyes, when she greeted him at the door with her well-practiced smile. 1 year after the death of his wife, a man traveling alone was carrying more than just cash. He was carrying a profound longing for human connection. Margaret stated, "Welcome to Millbrook Inn," with the ideal balance of warmth and professionalism in her voice. Kellerman's eyes widened as he inhaled the warm glow of the common room, the aroma of Sarah's venison stew, and the sight of Catherine arranging fresh wildflowers in spite of the season. "I'm Margaret Cunningham, and these are my sisters. We'll make sure your stay is everything you need it to be." A location where lovely, caring women would treat him like family, instead of simply another paying customer, was just what a lonely widower needed. The sisters gave Kellerman an experience he had never had at an inn over the course of the following 3 days. With her signature honey cakes, freshly baked bread, and expertly seasoned game, Sarah's meals were restaurant-caliber feasts. Margaret made him feel intellectually appreciated by having long discussions with him about politics and business. He felt significant and worldly because of Elizabeth's naive laughing at his tales. However, it was Catherine who gave Kellerman what he really wanted: the appearance of romance. After the other guests had gone to bed on his second evening, Catherine saw Kellerman sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with the expressionless face of a man who had lost all that was important to him. She came carrying 2 glasses of Sarah's special spiced rum, each perfectly warmed in firelight glinting crystal tumblers. She murmured, "You seem troubled, Mr. Kellerman," as she gracefully sank into the chair next to him. "Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." Kellerman spent the next 2 hours opening up to this stunning woman, who listened to him with such sincerity. He talked of his late wife Mary, their unsuccessful attempts to conceive, and how every evening he came home to an empty house that still had a subtle scent of her lavender soap. Occasionally caressing his hand or bending closer with seeming tenderness, Catherine listened with perfect sympathy. As the fire dwindled, she whispered, "Loneliness is a terrible thing, but it doesn't have to be permanent." No official record ever detailed what transpired next, but Kellerman's actions the next morning spoke for themselves. He ate his meal with the contented look of a man who has found his purpose again. Despite his initial eagerness to get to Kentucky, he decided to spend an extra 2 days. Most revealingly, he started planning to stay at Millbrook Inn again on his way back to Richmond. As he got ready to depart, he said to Margaret, "I've never experienced hospitality like this." Margaret grinned and took his kind donation, almost double the usual amount, pushed into her hands with sincere appreciation. "You and your sisters have created something truly special here. I'll be recommending this place to every traveler I meet. We look forward to your return visit, Mr. Kellerman. Safe travels." Thomas Kellerman, however, would never make it all the way to Kentucky. 3 days later, his horse was discovered wandering about Cumberland Gap without a rider. Kellerman himself had just disappeared, leaving behind a mystery that would never be formally examined and only questions. It was assumed logical enough for the perilous frontier that he had been killed by a bandit or a wild animal. The reality was only known by the Cunningham sisters. When Kellerman left that morning, Heinrich Zimmer was waiting in the woods half a mile from the inn. The German immigrant had the kind of quiet efficiency and tool handiness that made him useful for jobs that needed to be done discreetly. The blow that killed Kellerman was administered to the base of his skull with a blacksmith's hammer, although he never witnessed it. His large bag of gold coins returned to Millbrook Inn, and his body was wrapped in canvas and laid to rest in a designated spot deep in the mountain wilderness. Counting Kellerman's money and making plans for the future, the four sisters gathered around their kitchen table that evening. Margaret had calculated that the sum they had just purchased was more than the inn's actual earnings for a full year. Lonely men might be controlled with startling ease, as Catherine had demonstrated. Sarah had shown that with the correct chemistry and mountain craft, evidence traces could be removed. Furthermore, Elizabeth had demonstrated that even the most sincere of people might harbor horrible secrets. Margaret replied, "He won't be missed for weeks," as she carefully stacked the gold coins. No family, no close friends, traveling alone to a place where no one knows him. Perfect. Catherine said, "It was almost too easy," maintaining the kind demeanor she had employed to console their victim. "He would have given us anything we asked for." That chilly November night, they had found something far more valuable than gold. They had figured out how to make people vanish. The sisters had time in the winter of 1832 to perfect their method and set up the procedures that would benefit them for almost 20 years. Margaret created a method for determining optimal targets because of her astute business sense. The ideal target was a man who was traveling alone, had a lot of money, had no familial ties, and had no set itinerary that would cause him to be immediately alarmed if he didn't reach his goal. Sarah's responsibilities grew beyond managing the home and cooking. Her understanding of mountain flora grew to encompass a thorough investigation of poisons and their impacts. When prepared correctly, pokeweed berries may cause cholera-like symptoms. Heart failure that seemed natural could be caused by foxglove. Water hemlock leaves minimal trace and can kill in a matter of hours. In order to create a pharmaceutical arsenal that was camouflaged as a medicine patch, she planted these plants with legal herbs in a secret garden behind the main house. By mastering the skill of emotional manipulation, Catherine was able to understand men's innermost desires and position herself as the solution to their loneliness. She carefully considered her goals and modified her personality to suit their needs. She got deeply spiritual for the religion. She changed into a well-read conversationalist for the cerebral. She provided sympathy and consolation to the bereaved. Her greatest weapon and most terrifying skill was her capacity to transform into whatever a guy needed. Even though she was young, Elizabeth was essential to the operation's success. Her seeming sincerity served as the ideal pretext for the family's actions. In the presence of a girl who appeared incapable of deceit, suspicious guests could not keep their fatigue. Because of her innately amiable personality, she was also the early warning system, gathering details about visitors' origins, travel itinerary, and financial circumstances without arousing suspicion. The Zimmer brothers had figured out the disposal logistics with Germanic efficiency. Through a secret entrance behind a rockfall, Klaus had found a network of natural tunnels in the mountainside. Under cover of darkness, bodies may be transported there and concealed among loose stones, where the chemistry of the mountain would hasten the disintegration process. Personal belongings were meticulously sorted, valuables were saved, and anything that may be used to identify the victim was either destroyed or buried separately. The most important role was probably that of Ezra Hawthorne. He had an impeccable reputation in the area, and local officials took his word for it. In response to inquiries concerning missing passengers, Ezra would humbly affirm that the person had, in fact, stayed at Millbrook Inn, but had left in excellent health and spirits. Even the most persistent inquirer had always been satisfied by his honest manner and worn face. Their second victim, William Fraser, a tobacco dealer from North Carolina, arrived in the spring of 1833. Fraser was carrying almost $500 in silver coins, which were the earnings from a profitable crop sale season. He was a 38-year-old bachelor who was well known for his solitude and habit of traveling alone on business trips to avoid splitting earnings with partners. After weeks of uncomfortable travel, Fraser was instantly drawn to the inn's warmth and comfort when he arrived on a rainy April evening. The sisters executed their well-honed plan with accuracy. Margaret conversed with him on business, finding out about his travel schedule and financial status. Because of Sarah's delicious dinners, he was hesitant to continue traveling. With her charming innocence and piano playing, Elizabeth delighted him, reminding him of the daughter he had never had. However, Fraser's fate was sealed by Catherine. She discovered him reading by himself in the common room on his third night at the inn, a leather-bound book of poetry open on his lap. Despite her lack of knowledge, she approached him shyly and asked if he could read aloud because she enjoyed the sound of lovely words. Fraser read to Catherine by lamplight for 2 hours, and as she listened intently, his voice grew stronger and more assured. After he was done, she put a gentle hand on his arm and told him that his voice was the most beautiful she had ever heard. Fraser started to feel the loneliness that had encased his heart for decades. With a voice full of emotion he had repressed for years, he told her, "I've never met anyone like you. You make me feel alive again." Catherine answered, "Then don't leave tomorrow," her eyes reflecting the lamplight with a beautiful, measured truthfulness. "Stay another day. Let me listen to you read again." Fraser stayed a further week, during which time Sarah started adding tiny amounts of pokeweed extract to his evening tea, and Catherine progressively deepened their closeness. The symptoms started out mildly, with slight dizziness and stomach discomfort, nothing serious enough to warrant instant concern. Fraser blamed the mental turmoil of his sudden romantic sentiments and the strain of travel for his bad mood. Fraser was asked to join Catherine for a private meal in her room on his last night at Millbrook Inn. In addition to his favorite meal, Sarah had prepared a bottle of wine that included a carefully measured amount of water hemlock extract. Fraser was unaware that he was already dying as he sat across from Catherine in the cozy candlelight, talking to a woman who he thought might permanently alter his life about his fears and dreams. The poison did just what Sarah had expected it to. It seems that excitement and overexertion caused Fraser's death, which was a sudden heart attack. After a passionate night, his body was found in Catherine's bed the following morning, seemingly having passed away quietly in his sleep. The symptoms were exactly the same as those of natural heart failure in a middle-aged man who had previously led a sedentary lifestyle, even if a doctor had been available to inspect the body. Margaret added a final touch to their operation when Fraser was buried in the inn's modest cemetery with the proper solemnity. A proper grave, with its carved headstone, seemed like it was being treated with respect, but it was actually the ideal hiding location. Numerous generations of Cunningham family members were buried in the cemetery, so other burials were not noticeable to onlookers. Fraser's wagon and horses were sold to passing merchants, while his money and priceless personal belongings vanished into the sisters' expanding treasury. A few weeks later, his departure was explained by his choice to relocate to Kentucky instead of North Carolina, a logical story that nobody dared to challenge. The sisters developed an almost imperceptible technique by the end of 1833. In order to avoid developing trends that would draw notice, they had learnt to carefully space out their crimes, never aiming to harm more than 4 or 5 victims annually. They created cover tales for visitors who passed away at the inn, including everything from heart attacks to mishaps to choices to make the West their permanent home. Most significantly, they developed a total trust in one another, forming a conspiracy so tightly that not a single trace of their actions ever made it to the outside world. The tragedy at Millbrook Inn only gets worse just when we think we've seen it all. Share this video with a buddy who likes dark mysteries. If this narrative is making you shiver, please click the like button to show your support for our work, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. The Cunningham sisters were only getting started, so let's find out together what happens next. Millbrook Inn established a reputation that spread throughout the Mid-Atlantic region and beyond between 1834 and 1845. It was mentioned by travelers with the same awe that is reserved for the best businesses in Baltimore or Richmond. The sisters had built an unheard-of isolated mountain inn that equaled the finest urban hotels in terms of service and luxury lodgings. Margaret had greatly increased their legal business operations. In addition to running a small distillery that produced high-grade mountain whiskey and providing visitors with a stable of fine horses, the inn also provided Ezra Hawthorne-led hunting excursions. In addition to bringing in a healthy income, these legitimate businesses helped the sisters establish a reputation as astute businesswomen rather than just innkeepers. Their success is chronicled in the guest registration from this era, which is meticulously kept in the Virginia State Archives. Margaret's magnificent ledger book was signed by politicians from Richmond, land speculators from Baltimore, Charleston merchants, and explorers from as far away as Boston. Many came back again and again, becoming frequent customers who told their friends and coworkers about Millbrook Inn. But concealed behind this justifiable triumph was a meticulously planned murderous device that ran with perfect accuracy. The sisters had perfected the art of choosing victims. Catherine gained the almost superhuman capacity to recognize the guys who would always be missed, the recluses, the outcasts, the ones with secrets that prevented them from forming intimate bonds. With dozens of plant and mineral toxins, each with unique symptoms and detection profiles, Sarah's knowledge of poisons had grown. Elizabeth had mastered the art of using seemingly innocuous conversation to elicit intimate details from visitors. And, with the accuracy of a military maneuver, Margaret orchestrated everything. They reported about 43 victims during these years. The railroad surveyor later determined the precise number. Every death was meticulously prepared and carried out in accordance with stringent guidelines that reduced danger and increased revenue. Before deciding on a target, the sisters created thorough profiles of them, often spending weeks monitoring possible victims. Take the example of Jonathan Waverly, a Pennsylvanian land surveyor who came in September 1838. For months at a time, Waverly had to go alone through isolated regions as part of his mapping work for the state government. Along with remuneration for his job and money to buy land parcels he had identified as investment potential, he took surveying equipment worth a significant amount of money. Waverly was instantly recognizable to Margaret as the perfect target. His disappearance might go unnoticed for months because his job required him to be away from civilization for extended periods of time. His surveying efforts made for an ideal cover narrative because, working alone in hazardous conditions, he might have easily been harmed by a variety of natural disasters. Most significantly, he had few close friends who would look into his absence if he didn't return because of his rather antisocial attitude. The sisters launched their campaign right away. Waverly connected the food to the untamed alpine landscape that he found so alluring, and Sarah made special meals using game he had seen Ezra hunt. Elizabeth talked to him about his mapping work, showing interest in his technical skills and letting him know that his knowledge was valued. Margaret positioned herself as a local expert who could assist him in identifying lucrative options as they talked about possible land investments. However, Waverly's fate was sealed by the ingredient that Catherine supplied. She viewed him as a kindred spirit who shared his passion for the outdoors rather than as a possible romantic suitor. She had what appeared to be a vast understanding of mountain plants and animals, acquired over years of meticulous research that aided her poisoning investigations. Waverly found her ease with the outdoors irresistible, and she accompanied him on brief surveying excursions throughout the inn's grounds. During one of their outings, Waverly finally broke his professional reserve and told her, "I've never met a woman who understood the mountains the way you do. Most people see only wilderness, but you see the beauty and the order underneath." Catherine said, "I've lived here all my life and moved to stand with him on a ridge with a view of the valley. The mountains have taught me things that books never could, things about life, about death, about the balance between them." In reality, Waverly had entirely succumbed to Catherine's charms, so he prolonged his intended 2-day visit into 3 weeks, supposedly to perform more in-depth surveying work in the area. Over this period, Sarah progressively added stronger poisons to his diet, producing symptoms that resembled the early stages of mountain fever, a real danger that had killed a number of surveyors in previous years. Sarah created the poison she used on Waverly herself. It was an extract from killing angel mushrooms that caused liver failure over a few days. Even a skilled physician would not have been able to tell the difference between the two illnesses because the symptoms were exactly the same as those of mountain fever. The cause of Waverley's death seemed to be a terrible but completely foreseeable work-related accident. His surveying tools were sold to a Kentucky merchant, and his thorough maps were incorporated into Margaret's expanding knowledge base regarding the topography and resources of the area. His name was entered into the local records as another casualty of the perilous frontier way of life, and his body was buried with the rest in the walled mountain caves. The sisters' operation was brilliant, not only because of how they killed, but also because of how well they were able to keep up the appearance of respectability. They kept up relations with local families, gave liberally to community projects, and attended church services in the nearby village of Millbrook. While Sarah offered medical support to nearby farms when they were ill, Margaret was a member of the Regional Merchants Association Board. Elizabeth planned social gatherings that united remote mountain households, and Catherine taught Sunday school to the local kids. Their participation in the community served several functions, including giving them character witnesses and alibis in case they were questioned about missing visitors. They were able to obtain information about tourists that were visiting the area. Most significantly, it made them pillars of the community, whose word local authorities would never doubt. In order to justify their increasing fortune, the sisters also built a wide network of commercial contacts. They made investments in land purchases all throughout the area, progressively building up a portfolio of properties that increased in value and produced rental revenue. In exchange for interest payments and community influence, they made loans to nearby farmers and business owners. To diversify their interests and generate extra revenue, they even bought stock in a number of riverboat firms that operate on the Ohio River. The Cunningham sisters were one of Western Virginia's wealthiest landowners by 1845. Their success story served as a testament to what ambitious women could do, despite the harsh conditions of the frontier. The industrious Cunningham sisters, who had developed a prosperous commercial empire on their ancestral mountain land, were occasionally featured in local media. The neatly hidden remains of almost 40 men, who had made the fatal error of accepting the sisters' hospitality, however, were hidden beneath this facade of real accomplishment. Every death had increased their fortune and improved their techniques, resulting in a murderous and profitable circle that was hard to break or identify. Initially shielding them from detection, their seclusion now offered something even more beneficial: the ideal setting for their predatory behavior. A spider's web had grown out of Millbrook Inn, which appeared lovely and welcoming on the outside but was lethal to anyone caught in its strands. Heinrich Zimmer, one of their own employees, was the unexpected source of the end, not the police or suspicious family members. Following a hunting injury in the fall of 1849 that left him with chronic pain and a reliance on laudanum for solace, the younger of the two German brothers had been becoming more and more unstable. The years of taking part in the atrocities committed by the sisters had taken a toll on Heinrich's mental health, which his brother Klaus either overlooked or was unable to identify. Heinrich had always been the more sensitive of the Zimmer brothers. Over time, the laudanum which Sarah had first prescribed for real pain relief became Heinrich's way of escaping the guilt and nightmares that hampered his sleep. However, addiction has its own set of issues, including mood swings, paranoia, and a propensity for loose language, all of which increased his risk to the surgery. The situation started on a chilly February morning in 1850 when Heinrich showed up at the main house's kitchen door, his clothes rumpled from a restless night and his eyes wild with drug-induced terror. The sisters had already decided that the traveling merchant from North Carolina who had arrived the night before was their next target, and Sarah was by herself in the kitchen making breakfast for him. Heinrich muttered, his voice trembling with emotion. "I can't do it anymore. I see their faces every night. Every time I close my eyes, they're all standing there, watching me. 43 men. Sarah. 43 souls, crying out for justice." Sarah remained calm, but her thoughts were racing as she assessed the danger Heinrich now posed. He knew everything there was to know about their misdeeds. He could give authorities detailed details of how the murders were carried out, the precise locations of burial places, and testimony that would condemn all 4 sisters to death. "You're not well, Heinrich," she whispered softly as she approached him in what seemed to be worry. "The laudanum is affecting your mind. You're seeing things that aren't real." "No," Heinrich said in a perilous voice, and Sarah looked up at the ceiling, praying the visitor upstairs hadn't been roused. "I know what we've done. I know what you've made me do, and I know it has to stop." Heinrich alternated between sobbing confessions and irate accusations during the nearly hour-long talk, while Sarah attempted to soothe him without disturbing the other members of the household. Eventually, she persuaded him to go back to his cabin, promising that they would talk about the matter when he had had some time to relax and collect his thoughts. However, Sarah was aware that there would be no more discussion because Heinrich Zimmer had turned into a liability that endangered all they had worked so hard to build, and liabilities had to be removed. Sarah told Klaus that she had planned a special dinner for the Zimmer brothers that evening after their visitor had gone to bed, as a thank you for their years of devoted devotion. In addition to Heinrich's favorite foods, Sarah's unique spiced wine, which contained enough concentrated foxglove extract to halt a man's heart in a matter of hours, was served during the lunch. The same heart problem that had reportedly claimed several of their guests over the years was the cause of Heinrich's silent death that night while he slept. Due to his innate temperance, Klaus had drunk less of the poisoned wine and lived, but he suffered severe cardiac damage that left him weak and in need of Sarah's medical attention. Their immediate issue was resolved by Heinrich's passing, but new difficulties arose. Klaus started to ask probing questions concerning his brother's unexpected death, despite his physical infirmity. He was aware of the parallels between Heinrich's symptoms and those of a number of their visitors, and his devotion to the sisters was waning due to mistrust and sorrow. Margaret realized that a crucial stage was approaching in their endeavor. Any serious investigation would reveal evidence that even their great influence couldn't bury, and the web of trust and collusion that had shielded them for almost 20 years was starting to break. She started preparing for the likelihood that they could have to leave Millbrook Inn. Samuel Hartwell, a cotton dealer from Savannah, who came at Millbrook Inn in March 1851 with more than $1,000 in gold coins and banknotes, was the last visitor to pass away. In his 50s, Hartwell was a widower who traveled north to Pennsylvania to negotiate contracts with textile factories. After several days of extraordinary hospitality, which included close company with Catherine, he appeared to have heart failure, which was the pattern the sisters had prepared for his death. However, Hartwell's passing signaled a dramatic shift in the sisters' approach. They committed a serious error for the first time in almost 2 decades. Hartwell had scheduled a meeting with a business associate in Pittsburgh for a certain date, and when he did not show up, his colleagues started asking questions that finally made their way to Virginia local police. Despite having more than 20 years of experience, Millbrook County Sheriff Thomas Brennan was a competent law enforcement officer who had never come across an organization similar to the Cunningham sisters. His first inquiry was standard, a few inquiries to verify that Hartwell had, in fact, stayed at the inn and left in excellent health. With the help of meticulously preserved guest records that documented Hartwell's departure date and intended location, Margaret and Ezra gave their customary evidence. However, Brennan persisted longer than other researchers, and his research started to reveal minor discrepancies in the sisters' account. Days after the businessman was claimed to have passed through the area, a blacksmith in the neighboring county recalled shoeing a horse that matched Hartwell's mount's description. Another merchant remembered buying supplies from a man who looked like Hartwell, but the dates didn't coincide with the documented departure from Millbrook Inn. Even though these differences were small and may have been attributed to a variety of unrelated causes, Brennan began to have his doubts. He started investigating other missing people cases more thoroughly, focusing on tourists who had last been spotted around the Millbrook Inn. The pattern that surfaced was quite disturbing. As soon as Sheriff Brennan started looking into the larger pattern of disappearances near Millbrook Inn, his inquiry picked up speed. Upon reviewing county records, he discovered that tourists who were last known to be staying at the Cunningham property had been involved in at least 15 distinct missing persons cases over the previous 20 years. The different risks of frontier travel could account for individual occurrences, but it was impossible to overlook the statistical clustering. Brennan conducted his research in a subtle manner and avoided making direct contact with anyone associated with the inn so as not to draw the sisters' attention to his probe. Interviewing Klaus Zimmer during one of the German immigrants' infrequent supply runs was his big break. Klaus was more talkative than normal because he was still grieving the loss of his brother and was growing more dubious about the circumstances surrounding it. Klaus said to Brennan, My brother Heinrich, he was troubled before he died, in what seemed to be a friendly exchange outside the local store. He spoke of things that kept him awake at night. The mountains hold many secrets, Sheriff, and not all of them should stay buried. To a less experienced investigator, this enigmatic statement might have meant nothing, but Brennan saw the warning signs of a man grappling with deadly knowledge. After he set up a private meeting with Klaus at a place remote from Millbrook Inn, the whole truth started to come to light. Years of dread and allegiance fought against remorse and suspicion, as Klaus divulged bits and pieces of what he knew in his hesitant and partial confession. Although he couldn't bring himself to accuse the sisters of murder outright, he gave Brennan enough information about his brother's increasing discomfort, unexpected graves, and suspicious late-night activities to give him the proof he needed to get search warrants. On the 15th of April, 1851, around daybreak, a group of 8 armed deputies surrounded the Millbrook Inn to prevent escape during the raid. Given that the case potentially entailed crimes that occurred over state boundaries, Brennan had worked with federal marshals to make sure that any evidence discovered would be handled appropriately. The sisters displayed their usual poise when the police arrived. At the front door, Margaret welcomed Brennan with courteous concern and said she hoped she could help with whatever investigation had led him to their house. The idea that anything wrong could have happened at their reputable establishment seemed to really upset Catherine. Elizabeth appeared perplexed and alarmed by the charges being made against her family, while Sarah volunteered to provide refreshments for the officers. However, the physical proof of 20 years of murder could not be hidden by their rehearsed performances. A leather portfolio containing Thomas Kellerman's business documents, a collection of personal letters and photographs representing dozens of victims, and a distinctive silver pocket watch engraved with Samuel Hartwell's initials were among the items found during the search of the main house that were obviously belonging to missing travelers. Sarah's meticulously tended deadly plant garden, which contained multiple species with no known medical uses, was even more incriminating. Her library of chemistry and botanical books demonstrated a level of proficiency and toxicity that far above that needed for common home cures. Investigators discovered thorough notes detailing the effects and quantities of several plant toxins, as well as documents that unmistakably linked to the deaths of particular guests concealed in her private room. The last piece of evidence required to validate the extent of the sisters' crimes was the finding of the burial caves. Investigators followed Klaus, who was charged with accessory to murder, to the hidden entry behind the rockfall. The skeleton remains of 43 men and thousands of dollars worth of personal belongings were discovered inside the caves, much as the railroad surveyor would discover them months later. Every corpse revealed a different tale of brutal demise. The puncture marks discovered at the base of multiple skulls suggested that some victims had been swiftly murdered with sharp objects, most likely while intoxicated or poisoned. Others displayed symptoms of suffocation or strangling. With the molecular alterations linked to heavy metal toxicity visible in their bones, a few seem to have perished from poison alone. One of the most dramatic court cases in Virginia history was the Cunningham sisters' trial. Fascinated by the tale of 4 women who had run one of the most prosperous criminal businesses in American history, newspapers nationwide covered the case. Under the direction of Commonwealth Attorney Daniel Hutchinson, the prosecution produced copious evidence of a conspiracy that had killed over 40 people over the course of almost 20 years. Throughout the hearings, Margaret insisted on her innocence and said that any evidence discovered at the inn had been fabricated by adversaries aiming to damage their family's name. During her testimony, Catherine broke down entirely, alternating between sobbing confessions and denials that implicated all 4 sisters in the murders. Many people took Sarah's stoic silence, which she refused to speak, as an admission of guilt. Elizabeth, the youngest and most empathetic defendant, pleaded with the court for leniency, claiming that her elder sisters had forced her. The defense plan centered on the fragility and loneliness of 4 orphaned women attempting to live in a perilous frontier setting. Marcus Fairfield, the sisters' lawyer, contended that the sisters' youth and gender should be taken into account as mitigating considerations in their sentencing because they had been forced to take desperate actions by uncontrollable circumstances. However, it was hard to maintain any sympathy, given the overwhelming evidence and the startling extent of their crimes. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found all 4 defendants guilty on several charges of first-degree murder. The sentence was final and fast. On the 12th of October 1851, Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah were set to be executed by hanging. Elizabeth was sentenced to life in jail without the possibility of release, mostly because of her age at the time of the crimes and her apparent collaboration with the authorities. On a gloomy October morning, hundreds of people gathered to watch the executions take place as planned, marking the conclusion of the Cunningham sisters' tale. With no last words of regret or explanation, Margaret met her death with the same icy poise that she had displayed during the trial. As the nooses were put around their necks, Catherine and Sarah stood hand in hand on the scaffold, their last act of sisterly solidarity, in sharp contrast to the premeditated brutality they had inflicted on their victims. After being taken to Richmond, Virginia State Penitentiary, Elizabeth Cunningham would spend the next 37 years of her life there. According to prison records, she insisted on her innocence until her death in 1888, saying time and again that she had been duped by her sister and not a willful accomplice in their crimes. She never had guests, and she didn't write anything about her time at Millbrook Inn. After being given immunity in return for his testimony, Klaus Zimmer vanished soon after the trial was over. He was never formally located again, but some accounts put him in Missouri and others in Ohio. He seemed to be totally damaged by the horror of his brother's death and his part in revealing the sisters' wrongdoings, making it impossible for him to find a permanent home or build enduring connections. Despite being charged with accessory to murder, Ezra Hawthorne was given a reduced sentence of 10 years in jail because of his elderly age and cooperation with the authorities. He apparently continued to insist that he had never questioned the sisters' genuine intentions and had accepted their justifications for the numerous killings and disappearances when he passed away in captivity in 1854. In order to pay off court orders against the Cunningham estate, Millbrook Inn itself was put up for auction. The property's infamous reputation prevented the new owners, a Richmond family named the Fletchers, from drawing tourists despite their best efforts to keep it running as a respectable inn. After being abandoned for a number of years, the building was bought by a mining firm who destroyed the buildings and turned the property into an industrial area. A small stone marker was placed to honor the 43 men who perished at Millbrook Inn, and the court ordered the copper mine where the victims' bodies were found to be permanently sealed. According to local historical groups, the memorial is still in place today. It simply reads, "Here lie unknown travelers, 1,832 to 1,851. May they find the peace in death that was denied them in life." Regulation of hotels and inns in Virginia and the surrounding states was significantly impacted by the case. More thorough guest registration processes, required reporting of visitor fatalities to local authorities, and routine inspections of establishments catering to tourists are all requirements of newly passed legislation. They were referred to as the Cunningham Laws, and they persisted long into the 20th century. Most importantly, the Millbrook Inn case served as a warning about the perils of seclusion and the possibility of evil flourishing in areas remote from civilized supervision. A number of smaller-scale operations that may have gone unnoticed were discovered as a result of criminal detectives becoming more aware of disappearance patterns surrounding isolated companies. The full extent of the sisters' success was made clear by the financial analysis. Over $50,000 was the estimated value of their estate, which included liquid assets, company ventures, and property holdings. This was a huge wealth for the time. The funds were utilized to bolster law enforcement capacities in isolated regions of Virginia and, when feasible, to recompense the relatives of the victims. The sisters' extraordinary success can be attributed to a number of circumstances, according to contemporary criminologists who have examined the case. Their operation included meticulous victim selection, advanced means of murder, superior disposal procedures, and above all, a flawless cover story that rendered their crimes practically imperceptible to modern investigators. Their operations were kept private by the remoteness of their location, and a constant flow of possible victims was brought about by their reputation for hospitality. According to the psychological profiles created by contemporary specialists, Margaret was the main mastermind behind the operation. She had the antisocial personality, qualities, and organizational abilities required to organize and carry out such a sophisticated criminal scheme. Catherine probably had what is now known as borderline personality disorder, which allowed her to develop strong but ultimately pointless emotional bonds with victims. Sarah's proficiency with poisons points to a somewhat sadistic fixation with control and death. Elizabeth's role is still the most unclear. It may never be known for sure if she was a compelled accomplice or a consenting participant. The Millbrook Inn case is especially unsettling, since it could have easily gone on forever if Heinrich Zimmer hadn't had his mental collapse, or if Sheriff Brennan hadn't been so tenacious in his investigation. It's possible that the sisters might have carried on for several more decades. Numerous historical atrocities may have gone entirely unnoticed, their perpetrators carrying their secrets to unmarked graves. This is reminded by the arbitrary nature of their eventual discovery. The Cunningham sisters' story also emphasizes how vulnerable travelers were in the pre-industrial era, when transit was hazardous and communication was delayed. Between two towns, a guy could vanish and not be seen for months, if at all. With merciless efficiency, the sisters took advantage of this weakness and used the hospitality sector as a weapon against the isolated and lonely. Distorted versions of the Millbrook Inn story have been passed down through the generations in Western Virginia folklore. According to some stories, the sisters were isolated and impoverished, which pushed them to extreme lengths. Others changed them as mystical beings that used magic instead of straightforward seduction to entice victims. According to court documents and first-hand recollections, the reality is more commonplace and more horrifying than any ghost story. Long into the 20th century, local superstition kept Millbrook Inn's actual location at the forefront. In the area, hunters and hikers reported discovering odd items, including rusted metal objects, antique buttons, and pieces of clothes that may have once belonged to the sisters' victims. It is unclear if these finds were authentic artifacts, or rather the result of wild speculation stoked by the area's infamous past. Over the years, there have been other attempts to find more burial sites that may contain victims who were disposed of in other ways. A number of soil abnormalities associated with unmarked graves were found by ground-penetrating radar scans in the 1,980 seconds, but thorough excavation was not possible due to ethical and legal concerns. It's still possible that the 43 fatalities discovered in the mine only account for a small percentage of the sisters' overall kill total. Researchers and amateur historians who are interested in one of America's most effective serial killing operations are drawn to the Cunningham case file, which is kept in the Virginia State Archives. Together with Sarah's botanical notes and the tangible evidence found on the property, Margaret Cunningham's meticulous records paint an exceptionally thorough picture of how these types of crimes were organized and carried out in the 19th century. This tale demonstrates how readily wickedness can pass for respectability and how the most horrible crimes can be well concealed by seclusion. Monsters don't always look like monsters, as the Cunningham sisters' story reminds us. At times, they appear as amiable hosts, providing tired tourists with the necessities. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think all was disclosed? Or are those mountains in Virginia hiding additional secrets? Tell me what you believe actually occurred at Millbrook Inn in the comments section below. Please hit the notification bell, subscribe, and tell a mystery-loving friend if you liked this story and would like to see more horror tales like it. I'll be here to assist you in uncovering the many sinister secrets that lie in the past. We'll look at another aspect of America's covert history of terror in the upcoming video. See you then.